In the year 2062, Commander Franklin Elliott, along with science pilot Oscar Peterson, were on a mission aboard the Zeus 3 to dock at the United Nations Space Station to collect a species, an unknown life form, which had been found clinging to the outermost section of the station.
Oscar was very excited for this opportunity. The photos made it appear as if this species were tiny slugs. It seemed impossible that something could live on the outside of a space station. How was it breathing? Did it breathe? What was it eating? Had it eaten? How could it survive the immense pressure, the extreme temperature changes? Oscar could not wait to name the little guys. Listen, my name is going to go down in history as being the first human to identify a literal alien life form. Should I insert my first or last name? He asked Franklin. Hey, what about me? You're not getting there without me. Where does my name go? Franklin joked. It goes next to an asterisk when you're vaguely mentioned in my book. That's where the, oh yeah, and then there was this guy, asterisk goes. He laughed, and it bellowed through the shuttle. His laugh made Franklin laugh. Franklin wouldn't have wanted any other science officer to be on this mission with him. Oscar was always entertaining, and even though he had his nerdy moments, he never spoke to Frank as if he couldn't understand what he was speaking about, and Frank liked that. Upon their docking, they entered the space station. It was nearly new and vast. There were large windows on the observation deck, where one could go see the stars so clearly that they seemed as if diamonds were tossed by handfuls onto black velvet capes. Frank didn't think he'd ever get tired of the view. The vast blackness, open and beckoning for exploration, pebbled with the twinkling lights of the stars. The plan was to stay docked for 2 days, study the species at the station, and then place them in a pressure-sealed container to bring them back to Earth. It wasn't required that they live through the trip, but it was hoped that they would. Franklin walked into the science lab where Oscar sat looking through his microscope. So entranced was he that he didn't hear the door slide open and then close as Franklin came up beside him. So, I think we should call this one Sigourney and this one Weaver, Frank said to Oscar, which gave him a start. Oscar belly laughed again and told Frank that they could do that until they had their Latin moniker. So, what do you think? Asked Frank. Honestly, they seem to appear very similar to the Arion Ater, usually called the black slug, but it's not actually a slug, it's a mollusk, like a snail without a shell. See how when I touch this one? Sigourney, broke in Frank. Yes. See how Sigourney curls up into the shape of a C upon being touched? That's typical Arion Ater behavior. Of course, that's impossible. But I'll have to get them to my lab to check more closely. Obviously, one will have to be dissected. Take Weaver. He's the less attractive of the two. Oscar laughed, which made Frank laugh. Then Oscar said, It's a good thing for you that no one has to make that decision between us. Hey now, replied Frank. You know I'm more attractive. At least your wife says so. And there went that belly laugh. 2 days later, they were on their way back home to Earth with both Sigourney and Weaver, also referred to by Oscar as Oscar Arion Aters, saying that it had a nice ring to it. Their flight plan had been to re-enter and perform a ground landing at Kennedy Space Center, but suddenly something had gone wrong, very wrong, with their computer system, and they were unable to navigate the shuttle to the landing destination, but instead landed in the cold Atlantic Ocean, hundreds of miles from their destination. The shuttle hit the water around 4 p.m. and had sustained some damage upon re-entry, which caused it to slowly begin taking on water. What is our coordinates, Commander? Asked Oscar. I'm working on that, replied Franklin. Damn it. The salt water's shorting many of my circuits, said Franklin. his brow furrowed. He worked on the panel for quite some time before he turned to Oscar. I need you to work with me here, Oscar. I have no idea if our beacon is working, and I have no contact with Houston or the UN. It was dark by this time, and the water was shin-high. What do you need me to do? Asked Oscar, as he set the sealed container on a small shelving unit, not noticing that Sigourney and Weaver were both curled up into a C position. Franklin began, I'm going to need you to exit the shuttle and check on the underside of the unit to see what the wire panel looks like. We're going to fix it, if possible. Oscar turned to open the shuttle's door, put on his helmet, and turned on the light that he was placing around it. Here goes nothing, he mouthed to Franklin. But before he could jump out, a wave hit the shuttle, knocking Franklin to the ground, tossing the shuttle around like a tin can. Large bangs against the outside of the shuttle. Oscar knocked off his feet, trying desperately for a moment to hold on to the opening before being ripped away from the vehicle. A large tool that Franklin had been using struck his head, knocking him out. As Franklin slowly opened his eyes, he came to the realization that the shuttle had filled with freezing ocean water, and he'd somehow managed to float out before going down with it to the blackest darkness of the deepest waters. He gasped for air as a wave beat down on him, sending him under for what felt like several minutes but must have been only seconds. He felt around in the vast darkness for something, anything, to hold on to, and grabbed the first thing he felt. He wasn't sure of what it was, but it was sturdy and gave him the stability to stay above the water and ride the waves. He was holding on as he felt what was at first a quick bump against his knee. He quickly jerked it away before he felt something semi-encircling his leg. He shook both of his legs violently, terrified that there were sharks in the water. "Oscar!" he yelled. "Oscar!" Again. Suddenly, he felt something rub against the skin of his leg. He was confused. His suit was made to protect his skin, even in the worst conditions. They'd spent hours in pools during their training. He'd seen the suits burned, frozen, shot, stabbed, and it wasn't possible for something to have gotten through his suit. His mind was reeling, and he slowly reached into the black water to feel his leg, when suddenly he felt it. A bite, a tear, something ravaging and ripping at the skin, muscle, and bone of his leg, and he screamed into the darkness. Barely able to stay conscious, he looked out into the vast, pitch-black openness. His eyes couldn't tell where the water stopped and the black sky started. The stars twinkled in the reflection of the water and looked like someone had tossed diamonds onto a black velvet cape. He couldn't help but remember the nearly identical view from the space station as he suddenly felt a bump against his other knee. Some time later, as the dawn was beginning to rise up over the curve of the earth, he heard it. The voice on a speaker. "Commander Franklin! Commander Franklin!" He looked up at the NASA sailing vessel headed his direction. He was bobbing in the water, his body still being held up by the object he'd first grabbed onto as the boat came to his side. The seaman threw a rope, and he grabbed on and saw the look of terror cross the eyes of those young men. First, they saw the strips of flesh hanging from the bloodied stumps of what had been his legs, and as he was lifted, he turned slightly and realized that what had helped him stay afloat that night was the torso of Oscar. At a UN meeting 2 weeks later, with NASA being represented by Commanders Eric Adelson and Jane Weatherly, Jane spoke. To the leaders of the world, we can tell you this much: what we know for certain, and what is unfortunately speculative. On July 21st, 1969, Commander Buzz Aldrin found an unknown but living species on the outside of the Apollo 11 shuttle. He brought this back with him. It was referred to as Aldrin F, and experiments were performed on this creature. It was subjected to heat and cold, massive pressure, and various bacteria and viruses. Many different tests, and it survived every single one, but none had any bearing on its growth or appearance. Then, when testing various elements, it was discovered that one caused significant growth changes: sodium chloride. The German Chancellor raised her hand. Are you saying that salt, regular salt, had this effect on the creature? Yes, ma'am, replied Jane. However, Aldrin F was in a controlled environment. So that's what we know as fact. What we do not know is just how large this species can become when immersed in the sodium chloride heavy waters of the Atlantic Ocean, or even if they are still there.
Across the world, in Alaska, there were reports of dozens, maybe more than 100 dead whales, half chewed, washed up along the coast, along with feet and shoes. Ships being sank off the coast of Australia. The shark population reduced by up to 60%. In Oregon, large, unknown species of what appeared to be polar bears bloated and bursting open, chewed clean through various parts of their body.